The sun rose slow and heavy over Ash Hollow, Georgia, casting a warm orange haze over the cracked asphalt and rust-stained storefronts that lined Main Street. Heat shimmered above the pavement like a mirage, and the air already clung to the skin like a wet rag, thick with humidity and the sweet scent of honeysuckle. Ash Hollow wasn't a place you passed through. You had to mean to be there. Just 80 miles south of Atlanta, it was too far off the interstate to be convenient and too small to offer much beyond a dollar store, a bait shop, and the First Baptist Church, which sat like a cathedral of guilt on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where folks didn't lock their doors not because crime was low, but because they all knew each other, and more importantly, they knew who didn't belong. On the corner of Oak and Maple, the Ash Hollow Police Department squatted like a tired dog, squat and beige and built sometime in the 70s. It hadn't been painted since Reagan was in office. Inside, Officer Kyle Rourke sat in his cruiser with the engine running and the AC on full blast, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup and listening to nothing in particular on the police scanner. Rourke had worked this town for 12 years. He liked the uniform, liked the way people lowered their eyes when he stepped into a room. He liked how his badge gave him authority, how his presence created a kind of pause in conversations, especially when those conversations were had by people with skin a few shades darker than his own. He didn't say it out loud, but Kyle Rourke liked the old ways. He liked when people knew their place. And today, something felt off. The call came in at 9:47 a.m. from Patty, the front desk clerk at the roadside inn. Got a new guest, Sheriff. Don't recognize him, she'd said, her voice tinny over the radio. Black fella. Out-of-state plates. Real quiet type. Rourke sipped his coffee and grunted. I'll check it out. Across town, the man in question, Nathan Carter, sat alone at the small table inside his motel room, laptop open, a cup of black coffee steaming by his side. The blinds were drawn just enough to let in light without offering a view. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't inviting attention either. Nathan was 42, 6'2", fit, black. The kind of black that turned heads in towns like this, not because he was loud or dangerous, but because his presence alone challenged the local rhythm. His skin was a deep walnut brown, his eyes sharp, observant, and calm. He wore a button-up shirt tucked into slacks, shoes polished, beard trimmed. Everything about him was quiet precision. He didn't look like a tourist. He didn't look like he got lost. That's what made people nervous. He'd arrived just past midnight, under cover of darkness, and paid cash for 2 nights. Told Patty he was traveling on business and asked for a room at the end of the building. He carried 1 suitcase and a locked leather briefcase he never let out of his sight. No one saw him eat. No one saw him leave. But he watched. Oh, he watched everything. Nathan Carter wasn't here by accident. He was here because someone sent him. Because something was rotten in Ash Hollow. And it had Kyle Rourke's name written all over it. Rourke took his time driving to the roadside inn, letting the tires crunch over loose gravel and potholes as if the journey itself gave him authority. He liked the way people noticed when his cruiser pulled into a lot. It meant something. It meant you were on the radar. When he stepped out, the air hit him like a furnace blast, but he didn't flinch. He adjusted his belt, tugged his vest straight, and strode to room 107. He knocked, 2 sharp raps. Inside, Nathan closed his laptop slowly. He took a breath, composed himself, and opened the door. Rourke took one look and frowned. Oh, clean. Confident. Morning, he said. Morning, Nathan replied. You staying long? Just passing through. You got ID on you? Nathan didn't move. What's the reason for the stop, officer? Suspicious vehicle complaint. Out-of-state rental parked a little crooked. Folks noticed. Nathan reached for his wallet without argument, handed over a Georgia license. The name read, George R. Lane. Rourke stared at it a second too long. Mind stepping outside for a moment? I haven't done anything wrong. You resisting? I'm asking a question. Rourke's hand moved to his belt. Step outside. Now. Nathan complied. Hands where they could be seen. Controlled. Rourke spun him, cuffed him, pressed him against the cruiser before he could say a word more. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. The motel guests watched from behind curtains as Rourke opened Nathan's SUV and rifled through it. A briefcase. Black leather. Locked. Rourke held it up. What's in here? Business documents. You got the key? No. Rourke raised a brow. So you're just driving around with a locked case you can't open? Nathan didn't answer. We'll see what your story is downtown, Rourke muttered. He shoved Nathan into the back of the cruiser and slammed the door. Then he turned back to the motel manager, who had wandered outside, arms folded. Probably drugs, he said with a smirk. Nathan heard it. He didn't respond. But in the glint of his eye, something flickered. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. And Kyle Rourke had just made a mistake he wouldn't live down. The darkness of the Ash Hollow police station had always felt safe to Rourke, a fortress against the outside world. But today, it felt suffocating. The dim lighting reflected the mood of the entire building, a dull grayness that weighed heavily on the shoulders of everyone who walked through its hallways. Rourke hadn't known that this day would unfold like this. Not for him, not for anyone in Ash Hollow. The things that had just begun to unravel were bigger than he had ever imagined. It all started like any other routine arrest. Rourke had pulled over a car for a simple traffic violation, a speeding ticket, something he had done 100 times before. But the man inside the car, the one he had decided to arrest on a gut feeling, wasn't just any ordinary suspect. No, this man, this calm, collected stranger, was something Rourke had no idea how to deal with. The car, a black sedan, had looked a little too sleek for the kind of neighborhood Rourke was used to. The man who had stepped out, tall, dark-skinned, and impeccably dressed, had immediately raised Rourke's suspicion. He wasn't sure why, but Rourke had immediately assumed he was someone who didn't belong in Ash Hollow. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Rourke had barked. His voice had been steady, but there was something in the pit of his stomach that told him this situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. He was certain of it, even if the man before him didn't seem like the type to cause trouble. The stranger complied without protest, his demeanor calm, almost too calm. He handed over his identification without hesitation. Nathan Carter, a name that meant nothing to Rourke at the time. Just another random guy, he had thought, someone who likely had a few warrants or an old criminal record. It wasn't unusual for people to come through Ash Hollow, having gotten themselves caught up in a small town after running from bigger cities. What did strike Rourke as odd, however, was the fact that Nathan didn't seem fazed by the officer's orders. He followed each command with perfect precision, his eyes never flinching, never showing the signs of guilt or fear that usually accompanied someone caught in a bad situation. "What's the deal, man?" Rourke had asked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the moment. Nathan had simply replied, "Nothing at all. Just following the law. I'm sure you are, too." It was then that Rourke's instincts kicked into overdrive. He had tried to push aside the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but it kept creeping back. He ran Nathan's ID through the system. Everything seemed clean. Too clean. His gut told him there was something Rourke wasn't seeing, something important. It was after the arrest that everything took a strange turn. Rourke had followed the standard protocol, searching Nathan's car, taking him in for questioning. But the more he dug into Nathan's background, the more Rourke began to feel uneasy. The name on the ID wasn't just that of a random traveler. Nathan Carter was someone who worked in the highest circles of law enforcement, but it wasn't until Rourke searched through his personal files that he realized the truth. Nathan wasn't just a man with a clean record. He was an agent of the FBI, assigned to a covert operation in a nearby city. What had begun as a routine arrest was now an international incident. Rourke had no idea who he had pulled over, who he had wronged. But the situation wasn't just about Nathan's true identity. It was about what had happened after the arrest. Rourke had acted on assumptions, biases if he was being honest with himself, and now, in the dead of night in that cold interrogation room, The reality of his choices was staring him in the face. It was when Nathan finally spoke, his words sharp, cutting through the fog of confusion, that the twist became undeniable. "You made a grave mistake, Officer Rourke," Nathan said, his calmness unnerving. "I'm not just any man you can throw in a cell. I'm someone who has the power to make your life very difficult. More difficult than you can possibly imagine." Rourke had known in that moment that everything was slipping from his grasp. This wasn't just an arrest. It wasn't just a routine stop. This was something much bigger than him. Nathan's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Rourke felt the full weight of the situation. This was no longer about a simple arrest. It was about accountability and the consequences of his actions. The tension in the small, dimly lit room was suffocating. The air hung thick with the weight of impending consequences. Officer Rourke had never been one to question his actions before, never one to wonder whether he was right or wrong. But in the face of Nathan Carter's cold gaze, every shred of his certainty began to unravel. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Rourke demanded, his voice barely a whisper. The defiance was still there, but it was losing its power. Nathan took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Rourke's. "Because I knew you wouldn't have believed me. You wanted a reason to arrest me from the start. You saw me, a black man in a suit, and made a snap judgment. You thought you could control this situation, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." The words cut deeper than Rourke expected. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but the truth was too undeniable. Nathan was right. The moment he'd pulled Nathan over, he had made assumptions based solely on his race, his appearance. Rourke had done what he had always done. He had let his biases shape his decisions, even though he'd never admitted it before. It wasn't just about the arrest. It wasn't just about Nathan's identity as a federal agent. It was about everything Rourke had been ignoring for so long, the way he had justified his own actions, the way he had looked the other way when his own prejudices influenced his decisions. "I didn't know you were FBI," Rourke muttered, his voice strained. It felt like the words weren't enough to justify the mistakes he had made. They didn't even begin to address the bigger problem. Nathan took a step closer, his voice firm and cold. "You didn't care to know. You assumed. You assumed that I didn't belong here. You assumed I was just another criminal. But you're not the one who decides who belongs and who doesn't. And you're certainly not the one who gets to decide who deserves justice." Rourke's hands were trembling, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, or so he had thought. He had believed that wearing the badge made him above reproach, that his judgment couldn't be questioned. But now, staring down the reality of his own actions, the law seemed far more complex than he had ever realized. "I've made a mistake," Rourke said quietly, the weight of the words heavy in the room. Nathan's expression softened for a moment, but only for a second. "You're not the only one who's made mistakes, officer. But the difference is, I'm not the one in control here. It's not me who gets to decide what happens next." Rourke stood there, his mind spinning. What did that mean? What were the consequences of his actions? Nathan hadn't even told him the full scope of what was coming, but Rourke could feel the pressure mounting. He wasn't just a man facing disciplinary action from his department. He wasn't just a cop who had misjudged someone. He was someone who had broken the law, someone who would now have to face the consequences of that. Nathan spoke again, his voice like steel. "You'll face a trial, officer. You'll face the truth of your actions. And when the world knows who you really are, when they see you for who you've become, there won't be any more pretending." The sound of Rourke's boots echoed through the narrow hallway of the Ash Hollow Police Department, each step heavier than the last. It was the kind of silence that settled on the bones, the kind of stillness that spoke louder than any words ever could. His mind buzzed with 100 different thoughts, but none of them seemed to matter as much as the one consuming his every waking moment. He had done it. He had made his decision. He had arrested the wrong man. The weight of that mistake was beginning to settle into his chest like a lead balloon. Every step he took felt as though it were drawing him closer to his own reckoning. And the longer he walked, the more he realized that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Rourke had been a cop for years, long enough to believe he had seen it all. But he had never been faced with a choice like this, never had to confront the very thing that had once defined him, his authority. He had wielded it without hesitation, had used it to bend people to his will, to impose his vision of justice. But now, standing here in the cold, sterile silence of the station, Rourke realized just how much of that authority had been built on a lie. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. He wasn't the righteous enforcer of the law he had convinced himself he was. And Nathan Carter, the man he had arrested, the man he had wronged, had come to show him just how far he had fallen. What had started as a routine arrest had now morphed into something much larger, a confrontation between right and wrong, a battle between justice and prejudice. Rourke's hands shook as he approached the small interrogation room where Nathan was waiting. The agent had already been locked in here for what felt like hours, but Rourke had been too consumed by his own shame to even acknowledge the man's presence. And now, as he opened the door and stepped inside, Rourke could feel the tension in the air, thick and unyielding. Nathan was sitting at the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but Rourke could see the hardness in his eyes. The man wasn't afraid, not of him, not of anything. There was a calm resolve there that Rourke couldn't quite understand. He had expected anger, frustration, maybe even rage, but what he found instead was something far more dangerous: indifference. "Sit down, officer," Nathan said, his voice steady, almost too composed. It was the voice of a man who had seen it all before, a man who had dealt with people like Rourke countless times. Rourke hesitated but took a seat across from him. He couldn't bring himself to look Nathan in the eye. Instead, his gaze darted around the room, as though he were searching for something to steady himself. But there was nothing to steady him. No escape. No comfort. "I'm sorry," Rourke finally said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was all he had left. He had never apologized for anything in his life. Apologizing was a weakness, something he had been taught to avoid. But now, with everything on the line, he had no choice. Nathan didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, his hands still folded neatly on the table, his eyes never leaving Rourke's. "Sorry doesn't fix this, officer. Sorry doesn't erase the damage you've done." Rourke flinched at the words. They stung, but they were the truth. What had he expected? What did he think an apology could do? He had arrested a man who was doing his job, a man who had every right to be here, and now he was paying the price for his own ignorance, for his own biases. "I know," Rourke muttered, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to do my job." Nathan's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "You weren't trying to do your job, officer. You were trying to protect yourself. You were trying to hold on to your sense of control, your sense of power. And when you saw someone who looked different from you, someone who didn't fit the mold of what you thought was acceptable, you made a decision based on nothing but your own biases." Rourke swallowed hard. The truth was painful, but it was undeniable. He had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions quickly, to handle difficult situations without hesitation. But this time, his gut had led him astray. His own prejudices had clouded his judgment, and now there was no going back. Nathan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? You thought you could just arrest me, throw me in a cell, and nothing would come of it. But you're wrong. You're going to have to face the consequences of your actions, officer. You're going to have to answer for what you've done." Rourke's heart was pounding in his chest. He had always been in control, always had the upper hand. But now, for the first time in his career, he was the one on the receiving end of the law. He wasn't the cop handing out justice. He was the one who needed to face it. "I don't know what to do," Rourke whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know how to fix this." Nathan's expression softened just slightly, but it didn't make the situation any less intense. "You can start by being honest with yourself, officer. You can start by admitting that you were wrong. And then you can start making it right." Rourke didn't know what that meant. He didn't know how to fix something this broken. But he knew that Nathan was right. The first step was acknowledging that he had made a mistake, that he had allowed his own prejudices to dictate his actions. And the second step was facing the consequences. The door to the room opened suddenly, and Rourke's heart skipped a beat. He turned, half expecting to see one of his colleagues, someone from his department. But what he saw was a figure in a dark suit, someone who didn't belong in Ash Hollow, someone who had come to finalize Rourke's fate. The man was tall, with a cold, calculating presence that made Rourke's stomach churn. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, and there was something about him that exuded authority in a way Rourke couldn't ignore. "Who are you?" Rourke demanded, standing up from his chair. His voice had a quiver of fear in it now, something he hadn't felt in years. "I'm the one who's going to make sure you face the consequences of your actions," the man replied, his voice like ice. Nathan stood up as well, his eyes never leaving Rourke. "This is it, officer. This is where the reckoning begins." The room was closing in on him. The walls seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy with the pressure of everything that was about to happen. There was no escape, no way out. Rourke had to face the truth now, had to accept that everything he had ever known about power, authority, and justice was being torn apart before his very eyes. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement of Ash Hollow. Rourke stood alone in the small parking lot outside the station, his gaze unfocused as he stared into the fading light. The events of the past few days had been a whirlwind. His arrest of Nathan Carter, the revelation of his true identity, the confrontation that had stripped away every illusion Rourke had about his own morality. But now, in the aftermath, everything felt hollow. He could still hear Nathan's words echoing in his mind, every syllable cutting through him like a blade. "You thought you could get away with it. You thought you could control everything." The truth had been laid bare before him, and there was no denying the darkness that had crept into his soul over the years. For as long as he could remember, Rourke had prided himself on his ability to uphold the law. He had become a police officer to make a difference, to protect the people of Ash Hollow. But somewhere along the way, his sense of justice had become tainted, twisted by his own prejudices, his need for control, and his unshakable belief that he was always right. He had seen the world in black and white, with no room for nuance, no room for the complexity of the human experience. And now, standing on the edge of everything he thought he knew, Rourke realized just how much he had been blind to. The FBI agent, the man who had been his undoing, was right. Rourke had let his biases dictate his actions. He had arrested Nathan not because of any crime committed but because of the color of his skin, the way he looked, the way he carried himself. Rourke had made a decision based on fear, on an instinct that told him the stranger before him didn't belong, didn't fit into the world Rourke had created in his mind. It wasn't justice he had been serving, it was something far darker. Nathan's warning, the one that had come after the arrest, still reverberated in Rourke's ears. "You'll face the consequences of your actions." The words had been a stark reminder that no one was exempt from accountability. Not even someone with a badge, not even someone who had sworn to protect and serve. The truth was that Rourke had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He had abused his power, used his authority to control and intimidate instead of protect and serve. And now he would have to answer for it. But it wasn't just the law that Rourke had to contend with. The moral reckoning was far more insidious, far more difficult to come to terms with. He could no longer pretend that he was just a pawn in a broken system. He had been complicit in that system, had contributed to its flaws, and had allowed it to continue unchecked. The faces of all the people he had judged over the years flashed before his eyes. The countless individuals who had fallen victim to his assumptions, to his biases, to his need to maintain control. As the days passed, Rourke found himself struggling to reconcile the man he had been with the man he wanted to become. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back the lives he had affected. But he could make a choice. He could choose to confront his demons, to face the consequences of his actions, and to begin the long, painful process of redemption. And that was where his journey truly began. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be no quick fixes, no simple answers. Rourke knew that. But as he stood there, the weight of the night pressing down on him, he made a promise to himself. He would face the consequences of his actions. He would accept the judgment that was coming, and he would begin to atone for the harm he had caused. The first step was the hardest: admitting the truth. He had to look himself in the mirror and acknowledge the ugly reality of his actions. He had to face the fact that his career had been built on the very system he had once sworn to dismantle. And in doing so, he had to accept that redemption would never come without sacrifice. It would take everything he had, and more, to make things right. But he was ready. The second step was reaching out for help. Rourke knew he couldn't do it alone. He had already started to open up to the few people he trusted in his life, the ones who had always seen the good in him, even when he hadn't been able to see it himself. They would be his support system as he faced the consequences of his actions, as he began the long journey toward redemption. The final step was action. Rourke couldn't simply apologize and expect everything to be forgiven. He needed to show, through his actions, that he was willing to change. He needed to work, tirelessly and without hesitation, to make things right, not just for Nathan Carter, but for everyone he had wronged. It would take years, perhaps even a lifetime, to undo the damage he had done. But he was determined to try. He had learned the hard way that justice wasn't a simple matter of upholding the law. It was about understanding the complexities of the human experience, about recognizing that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And now, Rourke would fight for that justice, not with the badge of authority, but with the strength of character and the courage to do what was right. The story of Officer Rourke is one that resonates deeply with the fundamental nature of power, bias, and the need for personal growth. It is a story about the destructive nature of unchecked authority, about the ways in which individuals can become blinded by their own prejudices and assumptions. But it is also a story of redemption, of recognizing one's flaws and choosing to change, no matter how difficult that change may be. Rourke's journey is not one of sudden transformation, but rather a slow, painful process of self-awareness and accountability. It is a reminder that change, especially when it involves confronting deep-seated biases, is never easy. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable, to face the parts of ourselves that we would rather ignore. And it requires the courage to do the right thing, even when the consequences are severe. The moral of this story is that justice, true justice, goes beyond the enforcement of laws. It requires empathy, understanding, and the ability to see beyond the surface of things. It requires us to question our assumptions, to confront the prejudices that we carry, whether we are aware of them or not. Justice is not about punishment. It is about restoration, about making things right, and about healing the wounds that have been inflicted on others. Rourke's actions, and the consequences that followed, serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability. The badge he wore was not a shield that protected him from the consequences of his actions. It was a symbol of responsibility, a responsibility that he had failed to uphold. But in the end, he learned that the only way to regain his integrity was through acknowledging his wrongs and working tirelessly to make amends. For all of us, the story of Officer Rourke is a call to action. It is a reminder that we must constantly examine ourselves, our actions, and the systems we are a part of. We must ask ourselves if we are truly serving the cause of justice, or if we are simply serving our own biases and desires for control. It is a reminder that the work of justice is never finished, that we must always strive to do better, to be better, and to fight for a world where dignity and respect are afforded to all, regardless of race, background, or circumstance. The price of change is high, but the rewards are greater still. True redemption comes not from simply apologizing or seeking forgiveness, but from a commitment to do the hard work of change. It comes from facing our flaws head-on and choosing to become the people we were always meant to be. Rourke's journey is far from over. But it is a beginning that started with a painful confrontation and led to a long, difficult road toward self-awareness and redemption. And for all of us, it serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how deep the wrongs we have committed, it is always possible to begin again. But only if we are willing to pay the price of change, to confront the truth, and to work every single day toward making the world a better, more just place.